The words you are about to hear are a recollection of the strange details contained in 4 bizarre letters sent between 2 priests in the mid-1950s. The origin of these letters is believed to be from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Caldwell, Texas. However, while this church in Caldwell, Texas is thought to be the most plausible place the letters were uncovered, it was never fully confirmed where the letters really came from, as their origins are still shrouded in mystery. The details found in these letters recount the ghastly experiences of Reverend Thompson, a reverend father who had been sent by the head priest of the church, Reverend Kennedy, to the Cooper residence for a home visit. The Cooper family had recently moved to a home on the outskirts of Caldwell, Texas, and Miss Cooper, who had visited the church, had complained to the head priest, Reverend Kennedy, about some strange things she'd been experiencing ever since she moved into their new home. So Reverend Kennedy sent Reverend Thompson on a home visit to offer some spiritual support and advice. He was also asked to inspect their house to see if anything was out of the ordinary and to report his findings to the head priest. The first letter between the two fathers was sent on the 12th of May, 1955, and it read, "Dear Reverend Kennedy, I hope my letter finds you in good spirits and health. I'm writing to inform you that I have arrived at the Cooper family's new residence located on the outskirts of Caldwell. Following your instructions, I visited the Cooper's residence to offer some spiritual support to Miss Cooper after the complaints she'd been experiencing since moving into her new home. While I'm fully aware that she shared most of these complaints with you last Sunday, I want to see if there are any new details or if something had changed. So after greeting and sharing pleasantries with the members of her family, which were her husband, her mother-in-law, and her 2 sons, I asked her to recount these events that have been troubling her. She told me of the strange dreams she'd been having where there's a sick dying man who's somehow standing on her ceiling above the dining table and looking at her with cold eyes. These dreams apparently started 2 days after they'd moved into their home. She also says that she gets these weird headaches when she's sitting in the dining room, and during these headaches, she can hear the raspy voice of a man she doesn't recognize. The details of her complaints remained mostly the same, as it seems nothing has changed. I said a word of prayer with her and offered her the spiritual support of the church. I then inspected the house to see if I would notice anything strange, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. It is very much a peaceful and joyful home from what I can see. I even spoke to the other members of the family and they all seemed fine. No one apart from Miss Cooper has had any strange dreams or heard any odd voices ever since they moved into the new home. I believe the cause of all Miss Cooper's complaints is stress, as she looked visibly distressed while she recounted these experiences. I'm assuming her stress might stem from the hectic moving process or the adjustment period of settling into a new place. To calm her nerves and keep her at ease, we said a few more prayers. I blessed the entire home and took my time in the dining room. However, while I was there, I did notice something unusual as there was a foul odor coming from the ceiling. I believe an animal, be it a raccoon or rodent, might have died up there, as I told her husband to inspect the area and remove the carcass. Despite the odd foul smell, I'm completely sure this isn't related to Miss Cooper's experiences, as it's been fairly common for rodents to die in the ceiling and the walls across the state, particularly for those who live near the woods. I have offered Miss Cooper some words of reassurance and comfort, and I'm sure these strange dreams that she's been having and the odd voices she's been hearing will be long gone in the coming days. I believe she'll be fully settled into their new home by then, and her stress levels will have reduced. Lastly, given the lengthy distance between the Cooper's residence and our church, Miss Cooper has graciously offered me a room to spend the night so I can make my journey back to the church early tomorrow. Hopefully, if the travel conditions are good, I should arrive without any problems. As always, I remain fully dedicated to serving our parish, community, and fulfilling my duties to our parishioners with the utmost respect and care. Yours in Christ, Reverend Thompson. After the arrival of Reverend Thompson's first letter to Reverend Kennedy, the head priest awaited his return to the church the following day, but he never arrived. Instead, a second letter was sent on the 13th of May, 1955, and it explained how Reverend Thompson's journey back to the church was delayed due to a disturbing experience that he'd gone through after spending the night at the Cooper family residence. Dear Reverend Kennedy, let me start by apologizing for not arriving back at the church like I was supposed to, but there seemed to be more problems in the Cooper's household than I initially believed. I know I told you everything was fine in this home, but I've now realized that I've made a grave mistake in my assumptions due to the terrible nightmare I suffered last night. I had bad dreams before, but not like this. It began a few minutes after I'd laid my head to rest. I didn't realize when I dozed off, but I found myself sitting at the dining table in the Cooper's home. The dream was so lucid that I initially wondered when I'd gotten up from my bed in the guest room to sit at the dining table. It took me some time to realize that I was dreaming, and when I did, I noticed that I was now sitting across the table from Miss Cooper. We were both eating something I can only describe as a strange meat because no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't identify what was on my plate. Miss Cooper had a terrified look on her face as she ate, and I was about to ask her what was wrong when something fell from the ceiling onto my plate. It took me a few seconds to understand what it was, but I eventually realized that it was a maggot. The sight of the maggot on my plate made me want to throw up, and I wondered where the maggot came from and why it suddenly fell from the ceiling. In the minutes that followed, several maggots continued to fall from the ceiling onto my plate. It got so bad that I couldn't even see the meal I'd been eating anymore, and it looked like I'd been served a plate of maggots. I tried to raise my head to see why there was a massive amount of maggots falling from the ceiling and where they were coming from. However, when I attempted to raise my head, I realized that I couldn't move my neck. It's hard to put my experience into words, but it seemed like something was holding my neck in place and preventing me from seeing the source of the maggots that were now spilling over the table. Miss Cooper had stopped eating at this point in the dream, and she was now staring petrified at something horrific that was hanging above my head. While I couldn't move my head to see the source of the maggots that frightened Miss Cooper had stopped so much eating at this, I could feel it looming above me. This ghastly dream seemed like it had gone on for days, but I eventually woke up drenched in sweat. I didn't tell Miss Cooper or the rest of the family about the dream as not to alarm them, but Mr. Cooper told me something even more troubling after I'd awoken. He said he'd entered the attic early this morning and checked the floorboards directly above the dining room to see the dead animal's carcass that was causing the smell. But he didn't find anything there despite checking thoroughly, and he still couldn't tell what was causing the foul smell. Due to these recent bizarre developments, I might have to extend my stay and get to the bottom of this. I'll carry out a thorough cleansing and purification of this house. Rest assured, I'll let you know how it all goes. Yours in Christ, Reverend Thompson. The head priest, Reverend Kennedy, sent a short response to Reverend Thompson's disturbing second letter on the 15th of May, 1955. And in this letter, he showed his support and offered assistance to Reverend Thompson as he tried to understand what was truly going on in the Cooper residence. Dear Reverend Thompson, I understand your concerns and worries. You having that strange nightmare proves that Miss Cooper wasn't just stressed, and that there may be something truly malevolent and sinister hiding in the walls of the Cooper home. Please keep me updated with your findings, and let me know if you need any assistance in the complete purification of the home. Yours in Christ, Reverend Kennedy. The very last letter sent between these two priests was from Reverend Thompson on the 20th of May, 1955, nearly 5 days after Reverend Kennedy's response. The final letter contained vivid descriptions of Reverend Thompson's findings. He'd apparently discovered the source of the bizarre dreams and had come up with what he believed as the only solution to solve it. Dear Reverend Kennedy, I'm going to keep this letter brief as I'm at a loss for words. You may find it very hard to believe the horrors my eyes have witnessed, and I'm still reeling from what happened, but it all started on the 16th of May, 1955. I'd just finished carrying out a proper sanctification of the entire home. During the process, I used copious amounts of holy water and incense in the dining room, as I was certain that whatever evil entity tormenting this house resides in this dining room. I then said some additional prayers before Miss Cooper called everyone for dinner. After eating, the entire family went to bed, but I lay awake on my mattress as I couldn't sleep. I'd been having trouble sleeping ever since I had that nightmare, so I went out to drink a glass of water. However, as I poured myself a glass, my head became heavy and I started to hear voices coming from the dining room. I couldn't make out what these voices were saying, but I went to the dining room to investigate. I sat down at the table and sang hymns, but with every minute that passed, the room grew colder. The foul smell coming from the ceiling had now become overwhelming, and my eyes grew hazy, but I noticed something dropped from the ceiling above me, and just like in my dream, it was a maggot. As my neck wasn't constrained, I slowly looked up to see the most horrific sight my eyes had ever come across. Hanging from its legs was a rotting maggot-infested corpse. It bore no face as the maggots had eaten it away, leaving a gaping hole where its face should have been. It also had no mouth or tongue, but it was somehow able to make the strange voices that I'd been hearing. Its rotted legs had meshed with the ceiling like it was some form of twisted home decor. The sight and smell of this manifestation made me want to throw up. However, I had just noticed out of the corner of my eye that the corpse was holding a fork and a knife. Confused, I wondered what it was doing with utensils, but that's when the corpse lowered itself and stuck the fork in my head. The words I used to write this part of the letter can't describe a fraction of the excruciating pain and dread I felt at that moment. As I watched in horror, the corpse began to consume the uppermost parts of my head. It started to rip off my hair and throw it down its non-existent mouth before it cracked open my skull and consumed my brain and flesh. I truly thought I was going to die from the pain as the corpse cannibalized my flesh. I even tried to run, but some unseen force was keeping me firmly in place, and I couldn't do nothing but sit and watch as I was being eaten alive. The morbid experience went on for what seemed like forever, and it only stopped when Miss Cooper woke up to start preparing breakfast. She apparently couldn't see the apparition that was eating me whole. When she recounted her own side of the events, she said she woke up in the morning and found me convulsing. I'd been foaming at the mouth, and when she touched me, I collapsed. The doctor was called and I was bedridden for about 4 days straight with an unknown ailment and a very bad fever. It was only on the 5th day that I had enough strength to write and send this letter to you, as I'm still too weak to travel and tell you this in person. With all I've said and all the things I've seen in this home, Reverend Kennedy, I've come up with the only solution to this matter. I've had a lot of time to think about this, and while I initially thought about asking for the assistance of every Reverend Father we have at the church, I now believe this kind of evil might be beyond me, our combined efforts, and even the church. I ask for your forgiveness for my last sentence, as I'm not questioning my faith, but to purge this type of evil, I suggest we burn the entire home. I also fear that I and the entire Cooper family might be corrupted by this malevolent entity at this point, and to prevent its spread, I believe we should burn the house down with all of us in it if it comes to that. It is with a heavy heart that I write this, but I truly believe this is what must be done to prevent the spread of this eldritch entity across our community. I know it is a very difficult and painful decision for you to make, Reverend Kennedy, but please consider it, for the only way to purge evil of this magnitude is through the hottest flames. Yours in Christ, Reverend Thompson. There are no records of what happened after the last letter was shared between these two Reverend Fathers, and just like the true origin of the letters, the outcome of this tale has remained shrouded in mystery ever since. The Cooper family photo, allegedly taken in Texas in the mid-1950s, shows the family seated at a dining table with what appears to be a body hanging from the ceiling. Many photography experts argue the figure is the result of double exposure, possibly an accidental earlier image of the photographer that became inverted when the camera flipped. The earliest known digital photo surfaced online in 2009, leading some to suspect a hoax, though others claim to have seen it earlier. The image has also been linked to letters allegedly posted in 1997 on a now-defunct paranormal forum, sparking further debate about whether the photo was genuine or inspired by those writings. Despite numerous investigations, every theory remains speculative, as the original physical photo and the disturbing letters have never been found.
His name was Nathaniel Thompson. He was my grandfather, and he was also the greatest man I'd ever met. My grandfather lived a very eventful life, and due to the type of life he lived, he was a man of great stories. I can still remember all the times he looked after me during my childhood, and he would often tell me the tales of his time as a soldier. Nathaniel Thompson was originally an air mechanic for the British Royal Air Force, RAF, during his youth in 1919. He then climbed the ranks in the following years to become a decorated RAF wing commander who fought in 2 world wars. I truly idolized my grandfather, and it wasn't because he was a decorated soldier who served his country and put his life on the line to defend it whenever he was called. While all that was part of it, the real reason I admired him so much was because he managed to fight in 2 world wars and still come back to support and take care of his family. Over the time that I'd spent with him, I'd come to know every single one of my grandfather's stories by heart, as one of my favorite pastimes was listening to him tell me about his life. However, out of all the many stories that he told, there was one particular one that stood out. People used to always say that my grandfather was crazy whenever he told this particular story. But I believed him. And even though people around him had labeled him insane every time he told them what happened on January the 16th, 1919, I knew every word that he said was true. My grandfather always started this story by saying, "I've met and fought along so many comrades during my time as a soldier. But out of all these comrades, there's only one that I still see in my dreams when I go to bed at night, and his name was Frederick George Jackson." I often ask myself why I still remember Freddie so often after all these years. He wasn't really an exceptional comrade, a soldier like the ones I'd met later down the line. However, I remember that the only reason why I can still remember Freddie's face so clearly is because we both remained comrades in life and death. They always say I'm crazy when I tell them that Freddie remained my comrade both during his life and after his death, but it's the truth. I met Freddie when we were both air mechanics for the British Royal Air Force at the RAF Cranwell Training Facility. The year was 1918, and I bumped into him on the tarmac at the Cranwell Training Facility located in Lincolnshire, England. We were both part of Goddard's World War I RAF squadron, led by the then Flight Lieutenant Sir Robert Victor Goddard. After our initial meeting, we spent a lot of time together carrying out maintenance on several combat aircraft and airplanes across RAF Cranwell. Freddie was a cheeky and outgoing guy who always seemed to have a smile on his face, no matter how dire the situation was. We would often talk while we carried out our maintenance, and as I got to know him, I realized that Freddie was a man who truly loved living. He would always tell me that he'd been waiting for the war to be officially over so that he could go back to his wife and live a beautiful life with her, just as many couples did before the war. But unfortunately, tragedy struck, as Freddie never got to go back to his wife and live out their story, because he died on the 13th of that month. His death was a very gruesome one, as, despite being an air mechanic who was usually far from the fields of battle, there were still several dangers to our job, and unforeseen accidents were one of them. That fateful day, Freddie had accidentally walked into a spinning propeller, and before he could get out of the way, it was already too late, as the blades had made contact with his skin. The blades of the airplane tore him apart in an instant, and his blood and guts were everywhere on the tarmac in seconds. It was one of the most horrific things I'd ever seen as an air mechanic, and I threw up everything that I'd eaten that day. Freddie's death caused great sadness in me. I knew he was a man who wanted to live a nice life with his wife ever since the signing of the armistice on November 11th, 1918, when the accursed war finally came to an end. I can still recall going over to see his corpse after I had regained my composure. No one believed me, but I could have sworn that despite Freddie's horrible death, his face wasn't twisted in agony like many other soldiers who died during the war. Somehow, even in death, Freddie had a smile on his face. He was buried on the 16th of January, 1919, about 3 days after his death. It was a somber day for the soldiers who knew him at RAF Cranwell. After the funeral, the entire Goddard squadron was summoned by Sir Robert Victor Goddard, as he wanted to take a picture of all of us together. Taking pictures and group photos of the entire squadron during this time was fairly common, as it was often used to document squadron activities, and it also served as a way to honor comrades, both the ones who were alive and the ones who had fallen. In addition to that, taking these group photos also provided a way for us soldiers to preserve our memories forever. After we'd all gotten in place for the photo, I remember suddenly feeling a chill go up my spine. The sensation was so odd, as I'd never felt so cold before, and it seemed like I was suddenly freezing on the inside. A distinct metallic smell then filled the air around me, and it smelled like someone had just spilled an overwhelming amount of fresh blood. I didn't understand what was going on or why these strange things were happening. But before I could do anything, out of nowhere I heard a familiar voice say, "You seen my service cap, Thompson?" "I can't find it anywhere." The voice came from behind me, and even without turning around, I knew exactly who it belonged to. Goosebumps instantly appeared on every inch of my body as I told myself that it wasn't possible. I knew it couldn't have been him because he was dead. But before I could turn around to see who it was, Sir Victor Goddard had taken the photo. I stood frozen in place after the image had been taken, as I was too scared to turn around. It took me a few minutes to get the courage, but when I finally looked back, I swear to you, for that split second, I saw the standing, bloodied corpse of my friend and comrade, Freddie Jackson. Several parts of his torso were missing, and there was blood all over his clothes. But even then, just like he often did in life, Freddie was still smiling. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me because in 1 second Freddie was standing right behind me, and in another he was gone. I slowly walked away after standing speechless in that spot for several minutes. I didn't tell anyone about it at first because I knew even if I did, they wouldn't believe me. However, over time I felt Freddie would have wanted me to tell people that he was there, even if they called me crazy or insane. That's why I've always told this bizarre story of the air mechanic, Freddie Jackson, as even if it's hard for people to believe my words, I know that Freddie came to me that day we took the photo, because he truly was my comrade, both in life and in death. Whenever my grandfather finished telling the eerie story of the air mechanic Freddie Jackson, I noticed that he always had a worried and petrified look on his face, like he could still remember the sight of Freddie's bloodied corpse. Even as a child, I could tell that while my grandfather loved Freddie, he was also terrified of him. My mother, just like everyone else who'd heard my grandfather's story, always told me to pay his words no mind. Even though she loved him very much, she said there were no such things as ghosts, and my grandfather was just seeing things that weren't really there. Most of my siblings and friends who heard the story said the same thing, as they told me my grandfather was just making it all up to scare us. However, I always defended my grandfather's words to everyone who called him crazy, as I could tell from the look in his eyes that he wasn't lying. As years passed, I grew closer to my grandfather than anyone else in my family. I often visited him whenever I could, and rather than hanging out with my friends in my youth, I preferred to keep him company so he would never feel alone. During my grandfather's older years, he began to forget most of his stories, but no matter how much time passed, he could still remember the story of Freddie Jackson. He'd forgotten some details that he'd mentioned in the past, but he would always tell me that he still remembered Freddie. As the years passed, I could tell my grandfather had now reached the age where his health and his mind both began to deplete. He couldn't talk much or tell his stories anymore, and when he tried to, they were all just ramblings. I can still recall one particular day when I was taking care of him, and he suddenly held my hand so tight and looked me in the eyes as he screamed the words, "He's here again. He's watching me. Your mother thinks I'm crazy, but you believe me, don't you, Tommy? You can see Freddie standing behind me, can't you?" I could see the terror in his eyes as I tried to calm him down, but things only got worse from there. In the following week, my mother found my grandfather screaming at the dining table at some unseen figure, and he told my mother, "Teresa, his blood and insides are all over the plates and the blades are still cutting through him. I can't eat like this. It's unsanitary." At this point, due to the severe hallucinations, my mother had no choice but to take him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with both Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. This was a very hard period in my life, as I had to watch these diseases eat away at the mind of the man I loved so much. I took some time off of school and stayed with him to the very end. I told him the stories that he couldn't remember and held his hands when he was scared. The last thing I remember him saying was when he uttered the words, "I'm lying down on my back too often. I have planes to maintain, and I have to fix them. It's my duty to my country." Nathaniel Thompson died peacefully in his sleep on the 12th of October, 1972. He was 80 years of age and went with a smile on his face. His funeral was held the following week, and after it was over, I was asked to clear out his room and put his things away for storage. As I sorted through my grandfather's belongings, I came across an odd picture. It was from his time as an RAF air mechanic, and it took me a few minutes. But I soon realized that this was the picture he talked about in the Freddie Jackson story. I found my grandfather standing in the back row, and he was the fourth soldier from the left. Tears filled my eyes as I stared at the picture, but as I studied it closer, all my grief suddenly turned into curiosity as I noticed something behind my grandfather. I took the picture to the window where I could see it more clearly, and I could now make out the face of a man behind him. The man wasn't wearing his service cap like his fellow soldiers, and his face seemed a bit off, like he wasn't really there. I could feel my heart racing as I called my mother and asked her if I wasn't hallucinating and if she could see the ghost-like man behind my grandfather. And she said she could. The strange picture was then shared with the entire family, and everyone could see the man that we all believed was Freddie Jackson. I'd always known my grandfather was telling the truth, and the proof was always there. We all spent the entire evening sharing stories about him after I uncovered the strange picture, and in that moment, I knew just how happy he would be to have seen that everyone now believed him as we shared his stories. I teared up a little, and I hoped that there were airplanes wherever my grandfather was, so he could fix and maintain as many as he wanted with his friend and comrade, Freddie Jackson. In the year 1975, about 3 years after the death of Nathaniel Thompson, Sir Robert Victor Goddard, the former flight lieutenant and leader of Goddard's squadron, published a mysterious photo that depicted his squadron in early 1919. Sir Victor Goddard, who was a retired RAF officer and a decorated air marshal at the time, spoke about the strange photo that he had taken. In Goddard's own words, "I have a photograph in front of me, taken at Cranwell, basically by Bassano's at the time of armistice after the First World War. When the group photograph was put up on the notice board so that those who wanted copies could write their names below, those who scanned the photograph identifying friends then saw, or they were prompted then to see, the face of Freddie Jackson, air mechanic, in the topmost row. Capless and smiling, his face being partly hidden by another, his expression seemed to say, 'My goodness me, I nearly failed to make it. They didn't wait or leave a place for me. The blighters.' Well, there he was, and no mistake, although a little fainter than the rest. Indeed, he looked as though he was not altogether there, not really with the group, for he alone was capless, smiling. All the rest were serious and set and wearing service caps. Most had not long returned from church parade and marching in a military funeral. For Freddie Jackson had, upon that very spot, the squadron tarmac, 3 days before, walked heedlessly into the whirling propeller of an airplane. He had been killed stone dead instantly. He evidently was still quite unaware of it. Unfortunately, it's not a very rare event. There have been several such instances brought to my attention. What is somewhat unusual, to say the least, is the official photograph and some 200 witnesses who knew, also the certainty that there had been no hanky-panky in the darkroom. The strange photo of Goddard's squadron took the world by storm after it had been picked up by several papers in 1996. Several other soldiers who had copies also came forward confirming the story and the authenticity of the image. Bobby Capel, a woman who was part of the Women's Royal Naval Service stationed at RAF Cranwell during World War I and was there at the time the photo was taken, confirmed everything in an interview with the Fortean Times, saying, "There's no doubt that the face peeping out from the back row is Jackson." Miss Capel also told the interviewer that she knew Freddie Jackson before his death. The Goddard Squadron photo has remained one of the most mysterious photos ever taken. Several attempts have been made to debunk it, but they've all been proven pointless as the image was an official RAF photo, which made any tampering seem unlikely. Even Goddard himself said the negative was scrutinized for faking at the time and was found to be untouched. To this very day, the mysterious image serves as a timeless memory that tells the real story of an air mechanic named Freddie George Jackson, who came back from death just to take a photo with his fellow comrades in the Goddard Squadron.